So the astute among you will notice that I'm not Dominic Rowley, who was down to speak. And I only found out I was speaking on Sunday night, so apologies if this is a bit unprepared and totally unrehearsed. So just to tell you a little bit about myself first, I was a smoker on and off for 34 years. And when I say on and off, I gave up, I don't know how many times, and at least 3 times for more than 2 years, 3 years, and always went back to smoking. And that was until about 4.5 years ago when I bought an e-cigarette just to use in my car. And 2 weeks later, I'd completely switched. And about 5 minutes after that, I found out that the EU was planning to all but ban them, wipe them off the face of the planet. And so something had to be done. And some of us got together, and because there wasn't really a cohesive consumer voice in the UK at that time, we decided to form the NNA, and I was one of the 4 founding trustees. So if I just tell you a bit more about NNA, the gentleman on the left there is, his name's Moses, and I came across him outside Euston Station, and he was enjoying his e-cigarette so much, and he was so keen to tell me about how it had stopped him from smoking that I begged if I could take his picture and use it. So I'm very glad he agreed. New Nicotine Alliance is a UK registered charity, so we're a not-for-profit organisation, and we're very much consumer-led and focused. Over half of our trustees are vapers with no previous experience in either advocacy or public health. So we do very much kind of shoot from the hip. We say what we think, as colleagues along this table know. And our aim, though, is to improve public health through a greater understanding of reduced risk products. So what we're trying to teach people is that these are things to be embraced and not feared. And we also try to tell people why their particular research methods may not be the best way of going about things, and just generally put the consumer's voice forwards. And we believe that that greater understanding can, and I think in the UK has to a certain extent, led to better regulation of the products. So some of our activities, bear in mind none of us get paid. We do keep quite busy. So we speak at numerous smoking cessation conferences. We've spoken at the National Smoking Cessation Conference in the UK. We've spoken at least 2, I think, Public Health England conferences on tobacco harm reduction. We get involved with the media as much as we possibly can. We're quite often knocking on a closed door, we find, because you have to be around quite a few years and have all the right contacts, but we do our best. We get our voice in on national radio and national television, newspapers. We quite often write briefings for politicians and various others, those are, UK national politicians and EU politicians on the various things which affect consumers in this sector. We publish commentaries, we make submissions to basically every public consultation that relates to this field. We advise local and national healthcare practitioner organisations, so I have on numerous occasions been to local stop smoking services to teach them about the products. It's surprising how much more confidence they can have in showing the products and recommending the products to their clients once they've actually had one in their hands and pulled it apart and put it back together again, and they understand the basics of how it works. It seems to remove a huge barrier. And we also help research groups to understand the products and the people that they're studying. I mean, we've all seen appalling science that has come out simply because the researchers involved don't understand the things that they're researching. But probably one of the most important things we try to do is give the consumer a voice in this field. We've been, I think, fairly successful at that. We do tend to butt into just about every arena where e-cigarettes are being spoken about in the UK, and people do take on board what we have to say. So just a few of the specific projects that we've been involved in. This is a post note. So what these are, they're written by the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, and there are literally thousands of these things. And what they are is a briefing for members of Parliament, because obviously members of Parliament can't be expected to know about everything that they're expected to legislate on. And so what posts do is they produce briefing notes, and we were consulted on this note. So we managed to get our view across, and our view was represented in that post note, which all MPs have access to. Two of our trustees were also reviewers on this is the National Centre for Smoking Cessation and Training, which is our national training centre for smoking cessation practitioners. And two of our trustees were reviewers on the briefing note that they produced. Was it last year or the year before? I'm not sure now. Last year. So we made significant contributions to that briefing. We also, again, along with NCSCT, we produced a film called The Switch, which shows, I think, six vapers just telling their stories. Now, the idea of this film is to give people, well, particularly smokers, obviously, an introduction to vaping and the way it affected our lives and what they might expect if they were to make the switch. And we've actually got another 4 films coming out, which we're making with NCSCT and PHE. And PHE, I believe you've just signed them off. So those are on other aspects of e-cigarettes. So there's one on safety, there's one on the science, and I can't remember what the other two what the other two are.
Passive exposure.
That's right, passive exposure, and anyway, they'll be wonderful when they're out. As I said before, we get involved in research, so I'm currently involved in, I think, 3 different studies. I picked this one because my name's on the bottom of it. I was actually a co-author on this one. But I'm involved in another 3, and Andy's involved. Andy over the back there is another one of our trustees. He's involved in a big study going on at the moment in Scotland, and he's just, I think, finished another one in Scotland as well. So the idea of that is basically, obviously it's not advocacy, this is us helping research groups to understand and ask the right questions to get the kind of answers that they're expecting, or to get to the information that they're expecting without tripping over, as so many do. We also, we've got a library of briefing notes that we've produced, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just picked out 2 or 3 of them. So this one was one that we did for the Scottish Parliament. They asked us to do a briefing on public space bans, basically why that, well, they didn't ask us to say why it was a bad idea, but we told them why it was a bad idea. We did one for, I think that was for our government and also for the EU Parliament. It was the basis of our submission when the EU did their consultation about taxing e-cigarettes. It was actually a revision to the Tobacco Excise Directive, so it covers all sorts of tobacco products, but of course, being the EU, they decided to sling e-cigarettes in there as well. This was a very long letter that we wrote to our Department of Health, which was highlighting the pitfalls of the TPD. This was written, I think, during the period that the UK was implementing it, and we wanted to make sure that our Department of Health knew what the unintended consequences were likely to be of those of that regulation. And as if we weren't doing enough, we're also challenging the Department of Health in the European Court of Justice over the ban on snus. I don't know if people are familiar with snus. That's a pasteurised tobacco product which comes in small pouches, and people put it under their lip. I actually have a fake snus in at the moment. If anything, it's probably safer than e-cigarettes, and yet it's banned in every European every EU country except for Sweden. So we are taking them to court. As intervener, I might add, we're not one of the main parties. So why do we do this, bearing in mind that nobody pays us? It's because we're ex-smokers and we understand how difficult it can be to give up, but it's not just about giving up. I mean, For a lot of us, vaping, we vape because we enjoy it. We vape because we enjoy it more than smoking. That's what it means to us, but that's also a public health advantage, and we try to put that across. And because we have family and friends who still smoke, and we want those people to have the same opportunities to make improvements to their health and their lives that we did. We don't want that restricted unnecessarily. So we have a good understanding of smokers, vapers and vaping, and that means that we have something to offer. So, because this was rather hasty, I went to the website for this dialogue and I actually wrote down the questions that have been asked, and I wanted to just speak a little bit about the specific questions that have been asked for this meeting. And the first one was, is it possible to negotiate a consensus on vaping in public spaces? And the first thing that came into my mind when I saw that was, well, consensus between whom? Because it's rare that anyone actually asks us. And yet we're the people who are affected by these things. So when you're talking about a consensus, is that a consensus between public health? Is it a consensus with the government? Is it a consensus between the managers of spaces? To my mind, if you're a manager of a venue, then that should be your decision. Vapers have certainly got something to do in that some of them let the side down a bit in vaping inappropriately or inconsiderately, but most of us, we're considerate. You know, we're normal human beings. We understand where it's appropriate and how it's appropriate to vape. So, as Martin said, seeing as there's no known harms from second-hand vaping, then we should be having a sensible dialogue about this, and vapers should be included in that conversation. And the second thing about this is, what message are we sending when we send people outside to vape as we do people who smoke? This lady in this picture was outside Paddington Station, and they've actually got a line painted on the ground, one side of which you can smoke and one side of which you can't, and the vapors are sent over that line as well. So the message that you're giving people is that this is the same as smoking. It's just as harmful as smoking. It's just as horrid as smoking. So why would anybody, whether they be non-smoking, non-vaping public, or whether they be a smoker who's considering switching, why would they want to use a product that makes them stand over that line if that means that that product's as harmful or as disliked or stigmatised as smoking is? So that kind of comes back to what we aim to achieve. If we want people to switch from smoking to vaping, then there has to be an advantage for them. So it could be an advantage that they can vape in places that they can't smoke, or it could be the advantage that we're sending the message that this is something that's healthier and something that we want you to do. And you don't do that by banishing them outside into the smoking areas. And I suppose you have to ask, who are we protecting them from what? Because, again, as Martin said, you know, the level of toxins in second-hand vapour is negligible. So we're not protecting people's health. So what are we protecting them from? And who exactly are we protecting? I mean, this lady who's been sent the other side of the smoking line, she's not being protected from smoke, if there's anything to protect people from in smoke outside. So I think it's important sometimes that we check our prejudices. A lot of these bans are down to, if you like, an ingrained disgust of smokers and anything that looks like smoking. Because all vapors look like that, don't they? You know, this is what you see in the media. Every time you see vaping is something a bit like that. But to me, that's what vapors look like. They're just ordinary, happy people who are no longer smoking. But I can guarantee you, if I show you that photo to some people, they will spot that no smoking sign between those two, and then they will object to it because they're potentially vaping in a place that they shouldn't be. So getting on to the impact of regulation, Gillian already touched on quite a lot of this. And good regulation almost always has positive effects. It has to, otherwise why else would you do it? So it protects consumers from unsafe products. It inspires confidence. If people know that the product that they're buying is decent quality and it's going to do what they think it's going to do, then they'll buy it and they'll try it. So good regulation also encourages innovation. You don't want regulation that's so tight that that the industry can't make better products. But bad regulation does the opposite. And I think the TPD as it stands at the moment is an example of bad regulation, and I was very pleased to hear Martin say that it will be looked at. So bad regulation does little or nothing to protect consumers, and that's certainly true of the TPD, with the possible exception of perhaps the notification. Yeah, testing and notification. I think consumers and industry are of one voice when it comes to supporting that part of the regulation. But what the TPD also does is it places arbitrary restrictions on products, and again Gillian mentioned this, but if I can just put that in context, in the UK, the figure is something like 160,000 to 200,000 people use nicotine strengths above 20 milligrams. And the attitude so far has been, oh, it's only a couple of 100,000 people. Well, our stop smoking services would kill for that number. That's a lot of people to put back to smoking, would potentially put back to smoking because they can't get a nicotine strength that they need. And what that doesn't take into account as well is the fact that when people first switch, they tend then to use the higher strengths. So when you look at a snapshot in time, although you've only got 200,000, there's probably 2 or 3 million people who started on a much higher strength and who wouldn't have got to those lower strengths if the higher strengths hadn't been available in the first place. Gillian's mentioned other restrictions, and I was going to use the same example as you. I know someone who can't grip the 10ml bottles because she has arthritis in her hands and she can't grip them, and yet there's no reason for that restriction. So these are the kind of unintended consequences that we get from bad regulation. So the innovation focuses on workarounds. What we're seeing at the moment is a proliferation of workarounds for the TPD, which is, Gillian described shots, nicotine shots, and the short fill bottles. So you'll buy a bottle of basically flavoured PG and VG that's filled short, and then you just put the shot in. So there's a proliferation of those. But there's the same in the device market as well. We've seen things like things sold as tank extensions, and they're sold as spares, and there's things that come with fat coils that you take out and put a thin coil in, and all this sort of thing. And that's kind of where the innovation is going at the moment, because there's no incentive for industry to innovate otherwise, because what's happening at the moment is people, well, firstly, a lot of people stocked up because the TPD was coming. And secondly, a lot of people are turning to China. So they're getting the products that they want, because they can't, more and more often now, you actually still can get most things on Amazon, but more and more often now, if you go into a shop, you can't buy the thing you want. You get onto the internet and you buy it from China. And that's what I mean by the last one. So people are either going elsewhere or they don't look at all. They just stay smoking. So if we get onto the media, so this next slide kind of does it for me. These are the sort of headlines that we're seeing, certainly in the UK, and people will probably notice that most of these headlines, if you recognise the font, it's from the Daily Mail. I mean, do I really need to say anything here? When you're told that this e-cigarette is going to cause you cancer, heart disease, rotting gums, cystic fibrosis, all of these things, if you were a smoker looking to improve your health, are you going to touch that product? I think the answer is probably a resounding no. And it's totally irresponsible. So where does this come from? I mean, it's not totally the media that's to blame. What seems to be happening is there's some sort of publish or die attitude among researchers in other parts of the world, I have to say. Ours are actually pretty good, where even in their press releases that the researchers themselves are issuing, they're making claims that just don't come from the data. That then becomes sensationalised in the headlines, and the net result is the sort of errors in public perception of relative safety that both Gillian and Martin highlighted. So the last question that was asked was, between personal choice and public health, where should safer nicotine use sit on this spectrum? And I kind of looked at that and I thought, well, I don't know how to answer that other than with another question. And that was my question. Why do personal choice and public health have to be opposite ends of a spectrum? Now, to my mind, if public health is not aligned with personal choice to an extent, if it's not trying to allow for personal choice, then it's doing it wrong. It really is, because you're not going to make people choose something completely opposite just because it's healthier for them. It doesn't work that way. So that's the end of my hastily thrown together person. Thank you.